That being said, now on the bill we have a presentation by Pulse Canada. Greg has been with us here since I think 9:30 or before in the morning. So all ready to present. So ladies and without further ado, please welcome from Pulse Canada, Greg Cherewyk.
Morning, everyone. Feel fairly fortunate in that Murad sent that video after I had already developed my presentation, and he touched on a couple of themes: optimizing food for nutrition and collaboration and partnership. And I feel fortunate because I'm going to build on those themes with my presentation, so it's actually well connected here, the theme that he introduced this morning and the presentation that I want to deliver to you now. Now, you all know that on February 10th of last week, it was World Pulse Day. And for us in Canada, for myself and for our chair, Kevin Oak, who's here in the front, and for Mac Ross, who's our Director of Trade and Markets, and 18 other Canadian leaders from the industry, farm leaders and leaders from the trade, we traveled to Ottawa, our nation's capital, and we launched something called the Impactful Campaign. And I want to talk to you a little bit about the Impactful Campaign today. And as I do that, I'd encourage you to do two things for me. One is to pick up on something that Murad said at the end of his presentation, and that is dream big, think big, because I'm going to introduce some concepts here that require that. And then secondly, I'd like you to understand that I'm giving you a Canadian perspective, but I'd like you to think about how some of what I'm saying can apply in your country and in the markets that you serve. I'm having trouble advancing here. Should I just use the... Okay. Yeah, we'll go with that. Okay. So what is the Impactful Campaign? Well, it's anchored in a core challenge, and that challenge is one that Murad referenced, and it's impacting all of us, and that is that the global market for plant-based protein is growing, and it's projected, depending on which study you look at, there's a lot out there, and they're all very optimistic, but the one I'm referencing here has it projected to reach 8.1 billion by 2026. That's up 100% from 2017. And as our population grows, and in particular our population grows within this region, those numbers continue to climb. And our government in Canada, and indeed governments around the world, are focused on other numbers that are also growing, such as greenhouse gas emissions. In Canada, our government has set an ambitious target of 3 to 5 million tons of GHG emission reductions from the agriculture sector alone by 2028. Now, in parallel, of course, they want this sector to expand, they want it to contribute to jobs, they want to grow in exports, and make an increasing contribution to the Canadian economy and to our GDP. So what? Well, the question is, how can agriculture increase output to meet that growing demand, contribute to the economy, and simultaneously reduce emissions? Well, that's a question we asked ourselves, and we commissioned a report on what the pulse industry can do to meet those objectives. We commissioned some analysis through Cerecon Inc. that aimed to quantify the pulse industry's contribution to the Canadian economy and to the environment. And as this slide suggests, the findings revealed that pulses truly are the best for both worlds. They have a massive impact on our environment and on the Canadian economy. Now, I'm not going to dwell on this slide too much, but as I read through some of this, because this is directed at Canadian politicians, Canadian government in particular, but I want you to think about how these numbers could be pulled together and used in your respective countries to advocate with your governments. So what this one says here is that with 26,000 people employed through the pulse industry, We contribute 3.1 billion to the Canadian GDP and over 6 billion to the Canadian economy. Canadian pulse industry is a major contributor to the Canadian ag economy and, in fact, to the Canadian economy, period. But more importantly for this discussion, pulses are a powerful solution provider when it comes to emission reductions. When the consultants that we hired measured pulse crops, so beans, peas, chickpeas, lentils, and faba beans, against other major field crops grown in Canada, in a one-year comparison, they found that pulse crops could reduce emissions by up to 78%. When they combined the production of a pulse crop and wheat and canola in year 2 and factored in the residual nitrogen that's available for a crop that's grown after pulses, the 2-year crop rotation emissions can be reduced by up to 51%. But I want you to focus on this one that I've got circled in red here. Significantly, they found that including a pulse crop in a 6-year rotation, so in a rotation that did not previously include pulses, but a rotation that includes pulses with wheat, canola, barley, oats, etc., you can reduce the emissions associated with that rotation by up to 21%. Ladies and gentlemen, there is no other management practice, technology, or innovation that could be implemented so simply and so effectively as to reduce emissions by 21% in the rotation. This is powerful stuff. This is powerful stuff on the farm, but what if we took the power of those emission reductions on the farm and extended them through food and feed systems? Well, we've done that work. And today I'm going to walk you through just one example of what can be achieved, and we'll use an example that's particularly relevant here in India. We'll look at the pulse flour market. And again, Canadian perspective, some of the market information here is a little bit more relevant to North America, but I know that you can extend that and understand how it might impact you here in India and around this region. So this slide is a bit busy, but if you look at the box at the bottom of it, it says that if pulse flours captured just 10% of the market penetration for pasta, biscuits, plain noodles, instant noodles, meat and seafood, it could drive demand for an additional 530,000 tons of whole pulses. Now that may not sound like a lot here in India, but from a market perspective, that small amount of market penetration represents a top 3 market for Canada. Now let's stay focused on upside potential here for a moment. A neighbor to the south of us, the United States, consumes 13 million tons of wheat flour in the packaged food sector every year. Pulse flours comprise only 2% of that total flour use today. That's only about 220,000 tons. But the trend is very positive. In fact, pulses are driving a relatively stagnant flour industry. Companies are increasingly looking at pulse flours to capture that good-for-you plant-based protein appeal. All 4 pulse flour types, peas, lentil, chickpea, and bean, are registering strong growth. Compound annual growth rate between 2020 and 2023 was around 20%. And pulse flours are expanding into packaged goods. Over a 3-year period, 77% of growth is expected to come from those top 5 categories alone. So now what? What do we do with that information? The numbers are trending in the right direction, right? But how are we going to ensure that we grow them at a faster pace? And more importantly, how do we secure pulse crops' position as the premier source of plant protein, breathing life into those traditional food categories? Well, we believe the answer goes back to the question that I asked earlier. How can farmers reduce emissions while ensuring that agriculture continues to expand output and significantly contribute to the economy? To drive that point home, we reformulated 3 traditional products, wheat-based products, cereal products, to include pulse flours, incorporating varying amounts of lentil flour and wheat flour in these traditional applications. From a nutritional perspective, we were able to materially increase the protein and fiber, and as Murad said, we can do that without affecting taste, texture, and mouthfeel. We've had a significantly higher nutrient balance score when pulse flours were included in these traditional applications. But even more importantly, for today's talk, we were able to materially reduce the GHG emissions associated with each one of these reformulated products. Take a look at the pasta number at the far right corner. 30% lentil flour combined with durum wheat flour reduces the GHG emissions associated with that finished pasta product by 31%. That's not an improvement. That's a transformation. Again, what do we do with this? There's an opportunity here for this global pulse industry. And there's simply no better time than now to talk about how we can seize it. If there are some scientists and researchers in the room here, I just talked about reformulating pasta products. What if we looked at reformulating the public distribution system or central welfare schemes or the midday meal schemes and took non-pulse schemes and incorporated a pulse and looked at how we could optimize for health and nutrition and for sustainability? What could we achieve? From my perspective, India could be a leader in making these types of adjustments. They could lead that kind of change, influence change throughout this region. For all of you that are involved in business and have great connections with government, this is a conversation that needs to start now. Food companies around the world have set science-based targets. They're all committed to reducing emissions. Some have set net zero targets by 2030, by 2050. And they're all looking back at us. They're looking back at our supply chains and asking, how are we going to achieve that? This is one industry that has an answer. It has an answer right now. We can help food companies, we can help governments achieve emission reduction targets, and the solutions are not out of reach. Our collective common ground is that we need to enhance our productive capacity around the world. We must encourage investments into research so that our farmers can grow more pulses on more acres. And because farmers don't just grow crops to reduce emissions, we must grow and diversify the markets in the ways that I've been talking about so that the price paid back to farmers and to you in industry competes well with other cropping options. As our wise friend from NAFED has told me many times throughout this week, Mr. Singh, we need to grow more and we need to eat more. Our message is the same no matter where we are in the world. Farmers can reduce emissions while contributing to economic growth and health and well-being. And to our governments and to our partners within industry, an investment in your time, your energy, an investment in dollars into pulses is an investment into the economy. It's an investment into the environment, and it's an investment into our collective health and well-being. Now, Peter Wilson, you took an opportunity yesterday to plug the GPC meeting in Australia. I want to do the same thing here and take a brief moment to plug the Pulse and Special Crop Convention that will run from September 26th to 28th in Banff, Canada. Registration opens on April 1st. And because this presentation was entirely focused on sustainability, I want to know that we got you covered. So in an average year, we grow pulses on roughly 3.6 million hectares of land in Canada, and that produces just over 1 million tons of CO2 equivalent. Now, a further 867,000 tons of CO2 equivalent is reduced from the following crop due to that residual nitrogen benefit. So if you combine those emissions with the future GHG benefits associated with residual nitrogen, the total emissions for pulse crops in an average year is roughly 141,000 tons of CO2 equivalent. Now, because we grow those pulses on 3.6 million hectares instead of another relatively high input crop, where emissions can reach as high as 3.7 million tons of CO2 equivalent, the reduction in annual emissions from pulses in Canada is in the range of 3.5 million tons. Round trip to India, from India to Calgary, Alberta is about 4.8 tons of CO2 equivalent per person. So with 3.5 million tons of CO2 equivalent savings in Canada, we can offset roughly 729,000 round trips from India, so bring a friend.
Thank you, Greg. May I request you please stay on stage for a moment, Greg, and may I request the chairman of IPGA, Mr. Bimal Kothari, to please step up on stage and present our first presenter for the second day and a first presentation of the second day to Mr. Greg. Thank you, Greg, for a great start of day 2 at the Pulses Council, the Pulses Conclave 2023. We're still on the plant-based foods from Pulses session. It's going to be a very interesting session. Up next, a gentleman who is a very distinguished alumni of one of the very distinguished institutions in the world. That's IIT Mumbai. He's also with an MBA from